Hello, with this video, what I want to do is talk a little bit about chapter 16 in your books. Go ahead and turn there. The title of this chapter is Spread of Imperialism. What we will see here is how many European powers would spread their influence over major parts of the world and set up for the ability for these nations to be able to fight World War I the way they were able to. We'll go over about a period of 150 years, maybe a little bit more than that, but just looking at how they were able to do this. And again, it's the spread of imperialism. Remember, we've talked about this before. Imperialism is the idea and the mindset of wanting to go through and make your nation, your country, bigger. And the way you do that is by becoming the ruler of other people groups. An empire is one nation ruling over many different other people groups or other nations. And in this case, imperialism is the spread of that, or creating these large empires. As we mentioned in the last chapter that we've looked at in other videos that you've watched, the way you were one of the cool kids in Europe was by having overseas colonies. If you didn't have overseas colonies, you weren't really much to talk about. You didn't have that free income and that trade that would go through there. The raw materials wouldn't be able to flow through. You wouldn't be able to sell the made materials back to them. And it was a big deal that they wanted these going through here. But it wasn't just the fact that these individual countries wanted places for themselves. They also wanted to keep other countries from doing this. So what's the best way to keep somebody from taking something? Well, you take it yourself and make sure that they can't get it. So let's go ahead and take a look at this lesson here, the spread of imperialism. The first one we're going to look at, the first part of this imperialism that develops through here is actually the Ottoman Empire. And instead of looking at the Ottoman Empire as one that was growing, Ottoman Empire actually had a really big problem of shrinking. By the time the 1700s, 1800s, the Ottoman Empire had a major issue. It was often called the old man of Europe because of it was a very old empire. It had been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, even back into the time of when Byzantium or Constantinople had been conquered, and then they renamed it to Istanbul. Had gone through there, and they had controlled a lot of territory, but it slowly, just through inner corruption and turmoil and difficulties that they had with each other and with other nations, that it started to fall apart. And portions of the territories that started breaking away were territories in the Balkans. Now, the Balkans, if you're looking at a map of Europe, and unfortunately I don't have one in front of you, but you do have one there on page 284, the Balkans are that area there near Bulgaria, Macedonia, Serbia, Romania, Albania, and Greece. Those, northern Greece, that is the Balkan region. And we will have a lot of time that we will discuss those in later chapters because a lot of problems develop out of there, mainly because of how nation states were formed and how different people groups inside of those nation states wanted to break away and they weren't allowed to. And so we had a lot of problems there. So Serbia, Montenegro, Romania, and other places finally break away from the Ottoman Empire. They also lose control of the Black Sea. And the reason that's a big problem is because who they lose the control to? They lose the control to Russia and to the Ukraine. And these areas here that to the Ukrainian people, there wasn't actually called Ukraine back then, but to this here, this gives these nation states and these countries access to the Black Sea, access to the Mediterranean, and that's a big deal there. They lose a lot of power. They had been losing power for a while, but a big portion of this started back in the late 1700s, early 1800s. In the early 1800s, we have where Napoleon was going through. We talked about the French Revolution and how he had gone through and wanted to do different things. Well, one of the things Napoleon did was wanted to conquer Egypt. Egypt was a massively profitable and successful area, not just because they had the access to the Mediterranean Sea, but a lot of food and wealth and cotton was grown in Egypt. And if France could get their hands on Egypt, that would be a major benefit to them. While Egypt at this point they were not free, they were not independent, they belonged to the Ottoman Empire. So obviously the Ottoman Empire is going to fight against them, but also Britain did not want France to get a hold of Egypt. If France got a hold of Egypt, major problems for the rest of the continent there of Europe as France and Napoleon would get stronger and stronger. So Britain goes through, is able to sink a majority of the French navy while the armies are on land. They're in the country of Egypt, or it wasn't a country yet, but in the territory of Egypt. And then the Ottomans send several armies against Napoleon and are able to kick him out and defeat him in that area there. But even though they weren't able to uh, fully crush the French armies there, the Ottoman Empire, by their victories, did cause the situation to develop. Eventually, Napoleon does surrender in 1801 to the British while the Ottoman Empire regains control of his territory. And then, several years later, 1808, is when, and I'm probably going to pronounce this name incorrectly, it's uh, Mahmud or Mahamud II comes to power. Now, the way he came to power was actually kind of an interesting situation there. His half brother staged a coup and wanted to take over the government, called for Muhammad to be executed. He went through Muhammad's brother, killed the Sultan, killed the leader, wanted to kill off his own brother so that he wouldn't be able to take the throne from him. Well, it did not work. And so the people in the palace revolted against Muhammad's half brother, killed him, and then Muhammad takes the throne. And it was pretty a hard time for him to come there because this was during the time when the Ottoman Empire was losing a lot of territory. And so he comes in through there and he does do some things. He was ruling when Greece and the Balkans and other regions would gain independence. Also, remember how I talked in the last video of how France really wanted overseas colonies. That's when they went, remember, and were trying to attack Algeria and eventually got it. Well, Muhammad was in charge when France did that invasion. They wanted his overseas colonies, so they attack Algeria. And even though it took a long time to work out and a long time for the French to do it, they eventually did. They were able to throw off the Ottomans and they took control of the Algerian territory there in 1830. France wanted that colony and they were going to get it. But even during this decline, Muhammad did do a lot of good things. He did develop some new military organization. He went through and replaced it with a more modern one, which was very helpful there. So that's the Ottoman Empire, who is breaking apart, falling apart, and being picked at by France, by Germany, even by Russia. What we're going to look at now is some changes that developed in Russia. All the way back in the 1480s, the Mongols are finally defeated and Russia begins to set up themselves as a nation state. By the 1700s or the 18th century, Russia has grown and is the largest state in the world. Now, when I say state, I don't mean like the United States. A state, again, we would better understand as country. It's the largest country in the world, and leaders such as Peter the Great control massive amounts of territory all the way from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, which is a huge territory, much of the same territory they still own today. But there's a problem. A lot of that territory in the northern part of Russia is pretty harsh climate, almost useless for major society developments there. There are very limited growing seasons, and what food did grow was often not very profitable there. There was not mass harvest that they got. And the result was that the population of territory here was controlled by 14 million people, which sounds like a lot of people, but spread over that territory is not. It's a very small amount of people there. Now, Russia wanted to expand its territory. Again, wanted to be an empire, wanted to grow there. And underneath the leadership there, they did this. The problem was is that the common man in Russia was known as a serf. A serf is kind of like a slave, but there are some differences there. Whereas a slave is owned by a person or an individual, something like that, and they don't have any say. The serf is owned by whoever controls the land. And I use the word owned there. They're not actually able to be bought or sold as we often think of slavery was in the United States. A serf was one that you were born, lived, and died in the same area. They traveled less than 5 miles away from where they were where they were there because they were basically owned by the land, and whoever owned the land was in charge of those individuals there. And Russia would have to make some major reforms to benefit its people if it wanted to keep up and keep the people happy. Well, one of the major, really important Russian rulers was a czarina. All right, a czarina is a female czar. Now, oftentimes, czarina, they would call it that. Sometimes they would refer to it as a czar's wife as czarina, but a czar is a word, same word we would understand as Caesar or king, ruler, leader. That's who these were here. So Catherine the Great comes to power, and she's called the Great because she did a lot of really, I say, great things for Russia, but was also a very interesting individual. She was actually born in a German province and was engaged to marry the next leader of Russia, who was also German. And so when the when the Russian leader died, her husband became the new leader of Russia. And while Catherine's husband was going through here, they don't mention his name in the book. Now, you can look up his name and figure it out there, but he was a weak ruler. He was not very good at what he did there. And since he was a bad leader, he soon died. Now, interestingly, we don't know how he died. Many people say it was under mysterious circumstances. Some people say it was sickness. Other people say that Catherine the Great assassinated her husband so she could become ruler of Russia. Now, whether she did that, whether she assassinated him or not, the fact remains that the husband dies, she becomes ruler. She was a very strong, powerful, independent woman. And because of this, she was able to lead Russia for quite a long time. She was the leader that seized portions of the Ottoman Empire from during the Black Sea, or the Black Sea area that I told you about there. She joined with other nations and divided up the country of Poland that would not be uh, put back together until after World War One. And then also after she was off the throne there, Alexander the First came to power. In 1796, he continued expanding, took part of Finland from Sweden, and eventually going through there, he ended his reign after the years 1812. But they're going through and making a lot of changes that are going through. Catherine had instituted some changes and different reforms that some people liked, other people didn't. Remember, 1/3 of the population of the people of Russia are serfs, meaning that they are land slaves to the land, to the territory there. And they were not able to do anything to better their lives. Their lives were terrible. They lived in poverty. There's nothing they could do. Well, Catherine, back in the 1700s, tried to institute a policy that said you are allowed to sell the serfs, but not sell the land. So that makes them actual slaves at that point. Before, if I owned if I owned land, if I owned a town that the land the town was on, or a village, let's go with a village instead. If I owned land and there was a village on that land, then what would happen is if I wanted to sell it, I would sell the land and the buildings, the crops, and the people that lived there would all be part of the deal. Well, Catherine the Great said, I have a wonderful idea. What I'm going to do is allow you to sell the land, but you don't have to sell the serfs, or the other way around. I'm going to have you be allowed to sell the serfs, but you don't have to sell the land. Well, that makes them literal slaves at that point. Obviously, the serfs did not appreciate this, and they revolt. They get together in large bands. They almost enter the city of Moscow itself before the royal forces brutally massacre them, just completely wipe them out. And after this, the Russian rulers began to realize we needed to do something to change this, try to keep our serfs happy, to keep these violent protests down. But this would mark the beginning of an era where the serfs of Russia, if they did not like something, they revolted in these brutal attacks. Later, after Alexander the First was Tsar, you would have Nicholas the First. He came to power in the middle of one of these revolts. Several of his well-educated Russians, one of the things that some of the Russian rulers wanted was them to be more Europeanized. So they go and actually pay, as the Russian ruler, they pay for them and say, go to Europe, go to these universities, go to these governments, go to these areas here, and learn about them. What you learn, bring back, will apply it to Russia, and make Russia powerful, will make Russia wonderful. They learn about representative governments, what we have here in the United States, where people vote for the ones that you want to be in charge of you, different things there. And they bring these back, and as a result, these small nobles and some military leaders, army officers, sought to replace Nicholas I with a representative government, and his brother, who would also go along with this. Well, this rebellion occurs in December of 1825 and became known as the Decembrists' Revolt. And one of the problems is that this did not work. The forces of Russia were able to defeat these revolutionaries, and what this did was force the idea of any type of representative government or where the people would have more say in their government was shoved way, way down. He goes through and actually, whereas Peter the Great, who had started this Europeanizing of Russia, Nicholas I said, nope, we're going to do the opposite. We are going to embrace orthodoxy, in other words, the church, autocracy. We are going to rule ourselves without the influence of anybody else, and nationality. We are going to do it the way Russia does it, because Russia is the greatest. As a result, some major oppression begins to develop. Well, when you have oppression, you also have people that want to go against it. One of those was named Michael, and I'm probably pronounce his name wrong, Bakunin. He was a friend of somebody we've talked about, Karl Marx. This Bakunin character supported something called anarchy. Anarchy is a type of government where there is no government. Basically, it's rule by chaos, is what they would have there. And he wanted to do this. He wanted to go through and through anarchy, through this teachings and idea, and again, remember Karl Marx with his communism and his violent uprisings that he wanted to have going through there, they were wanting to do that. Well, Alexander II, who came to power after Alexander I, goes through and realizes some things. First of all, after Napoleon had invaded and Alexander I had said that we're not going to do too many reforms, we'll do some, but not overall, Alexander II says, okay, we need to do some reforms. What we need to do is change some things. He goes through and abolishes serfdom. You are no longer beholden to the land that you live on. If you want to move to the city, you can do that. If you want to sell your home and move to another village, you can do that. If you want to stay there and work your land, you can do that. You are no longer serfs, which is a huge, fantastic, wonderful benefit, breakthrough for these people. So that means that 23 million of 67 million people, so almost half the population of Russia, are no longer land slaves. But just because the freed serfs, the peasants here, are now able to do this, they didn't receive the land. So if they wanted to work the land where they were, they had to now pay taxes to the landholders, or to the governor, or to the government, who would then go by and give all of this massive amounts of money to the nobles. And the rich would get richer, and the poor stayed poor. And this went all the way up with this idea of serfdom and things like that, or the abolition of serfdom. Alexander II ruled until 1881. That's only 30 years before the start of World War I. This is a very short time period. And so we will see how this idea and this mindset of serfs and these, well, they're peasants now, they're not serfs anymore, but how these peasants and these crowds are beginning to be not thrilled with what's going on. Simply abolishing the serfdom policies did not improve the lives of almost half the population of Russia. After Alexander II died, the way he died, he was assassinated. Well, Alexander III, the next ruler, who would rule until 1894, looked at it and said, there is no possible way that I am going to be assassinated. So anytime there was a threat to the monarchy, he brutally ended it, killed many, many people. So he removed all threats, both imaginary and real. If he thought you were going to be a threat, he ended you. And that's what Alexander III did going through there. He was part of the Romanov dynasty, and we will look at more of that later. He persecuted massive amounts of groups. He would persecute Polish people and people that lived in Finland. A lot of the Jewish pogroms took place under his leadership there. He also censored the press. He would not let the newspapers write articles that were not good for him. Well, one of the influences that happened here, we're going to back up just a little bit and talk about the Napoleon's invasion of Russia. As he goes through and invades Russia, the Russian armies, every time that they tried to face Napoleon's army, they would just get defeated. Napoleon's army was amazing. He even called it the Grand Army. And so every time that they would face it, the French army would come in, then the Russian army would just get destroyed. So what the Russian army would do was when the French army would come up, the Russian army would just move back. So the French would come up more, they move back some more, come up more, move back. Well, the Russian army didn't just move back, but anything that would have been useful to the French, they destroyed. They tore down homes, villages, burned entire towns, destroyed massive fields of crops, moved all livestock further inland the country. And these are the Russians doing this to the Russian land because they don't want to leave anything that the French army can use to supply themselves. And eventually, the the Napoleon's army gets stuck in Russia during a Russian winter. And the reason that's a problem is because Napoleon's supply lines are now 1,000 miles long and they have no winter gear. They have no coats or heavy boots or anything for that. And 90% of Napoleon's army dies from the winter and their retreat from the Russian winter while the Russian armies are now able to face them. And they go through there. If you've ever heard the Tchaikovsky's piece, the composer, the Russian composer, the 1812 Overture, this is a celebration of the destruction of the Russian, or by the Russians of the French Grand Army. We're going to stop there with this lesson. No homework with what you're going through there. The next lesson we will go over the domination of India and also China, some other portions there, and then also Japan as well. So no work, as I said, in your things, unless there is on the paper. I don't believe it is. Let me just check. Yeah, so no assignments due for this. Have a great day.